for a long time, I was like, I'm going to write about climate change from an earth science perspective, and I just want to know the science. And, I'll leave the political and social stuff to people who are experts in that. And what I've realized is that, like, in completely hijacking the global carbon cycle, now, the temperature of the planet in the future, and the pH of the oceans, and the oxygen levels in the oceans is no longer, determined by Earth system processes like it has been for all of Earth history. It is fundamentally rooted through human institutions. There really isn't any disentangling the science from the political at this point.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Peter Brannen. Peter is an award-winning science journalist whose work has appeared in The Guardian, Wired, New York Times, Washington Post, etc. He's also the author of The Ends of the World, Volcanic Apocalypses, Lethal Oceans, and Our Quest to Understand Earth's Past Mass Extinctions. And Peter joined me to discuss exactly that. The 5 mass extinctions of Earth's history and how we are hurtling towards a 6th one, putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a rate that has never before been seen on this planet. So this is what Peter does. He contextualizes the climate crisis in deep time. On the episode, he talks about the links between the carbon dioxide and mass extinctions, the carbon cycle, how we're impacting the carbon cycle, and drawing comparisons to past mass extinctions. He talks about the other drivers of mass extinction that we are already seeing and how long it takes for the Earth to recover from such events. Make no mistake, this is a one-off event in Earth's history. The fact that this is human engineered, but as Peter points out, that also means that we have the opportunity to do something about it. Peter doesn't think that we're going to go extinct and explains precisely where we are in relation to the possibility of a 6th mass extinction event. But these are the crucial decades if we are to mitigate, because the pace at which we're going is absolutely catastrophic and we need absolute systems overhaul, eroding vested power interests, as he says, if we're going to avoid the worst possible outcomes. But one thing is certain, our industrialized world cannot survive. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Peter, thank you very much for joining me on Planet Critical. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
My first question, why is the world in crisis?
Well, it depends how far back you want to start this story. And I guess just sort of to introduce the reader to my work, I look at the climate crisis from sort of a deep time perspective. So in the past, I've written about these really terrible climate change events driven by CO2, volcanic CO2 hundreds of millions of years ago that caused some of the biggest mass extinctions in Earth history. And in the course of writing that book, I sort of realized that there's this bigger story about what carbon and CO2 is on this planet, and sort of that its behavior on Earth as it moves between the rocks and the atmosphere and the oceans and through life is sort of what makes Earth Earth. And it's one of the main reasons you don't want to mess with it too much, because this is called the carbon cycle, and it's why the planet's habitable, and why we're having this conversation right now. And in the humans have always been, since the earliest days of our evolution, an important component of landscape, and have moved nutrients around and have used fire to our advantage. And in the past 200 years, kind of bizarrely, we have come to completely dominate the carbon cycle in ways that you only ever see in Earth history once every 100 million years or so, when you have these sort of mind-blowing volcanic eruptions that cover entire continents and inject a lot of CO2 into the air. And so the eruption of this geological store of energy that's been accumulating for 500 million years in the Earth's crust, all at once, essentially, from a geological perspective, there's no way you can do that, I don't think, and have it not be completely disruptive and catastrophic in some ways. And it shouldn't surprise us that the surface of the planet and human societies have been totally transformed by this explosion of energy and carbon out of the crust in a matter of decades. And one of the reasons why I like to study these old geological events is because I think it's hard to reckon with just how extreme and unprecedented what we're doing on the surface of the planet is right now, without this deep time perspective. Sometimes you'll hear historians talk about, the little ice age a few hundred years ago, that was climate change, and humans made it through that. And there have been these little volcanic eruptions that have been bad for agriculture for a few years, and humans made it through that. And so we're really resilient. And it's true that we're really resilient, but those things are not even remotely, they're not even worth talking about in the same, book as the scale of what we're doing now and the scale of these analogs in Earth history. So to take the little ice age, for example, it changed global temperatures by less than half a degree. And the fact that
it?
Yeah, and it was mostly a northern hemisphere phenomenon, and it was mostly in Western Europe and North America, I believe. But it wasn't global scale climate change. What we're doing now by launching the planet potentially into climates that haven't been seen since before the evolution of Homo sapiens, well before, in fact, and potentially, well before. I just think it's such a unpredictable what the effects are going to be on that, and we shouldn't be surprised if there's surprises in the future because of the sort of unprecedented nature of what we're doing, and the fact that we now have this networked global industrial civilization, and I don't think we understand what the weak points in that are. And to say that we understand the response of this nonlinear complex system to this geologically unprecedented perturbation, it just makes me very, very nervous, as I think it does you and it does all your listeners. So that was a very roundabout answer, but yeah, generally that's why things look the way they do. And I know that I'm using a lot of loaded language like we when I say this, and obviously the development of the fossil fuel industry and the Industrial Revolution, these are all sort of came out of developments in a particular part of the world. I don't mean to sort of implicate all of humanity in the sort of environmental destruction of the last 2 centuries.
So the world is in crisis because humanity and a particular class and actually a particular race of humanity has meddled with the carbon cycle to the extent that we are bringing upon a geological event, the likes of which is normally only seen once every 100 million years.
Yeah, that seems like a fair summary of my very circuitous answer.
So, let's maybe go back through some of these other geological events.
Mm-hmm.
Could you pick one and sort of talk to us what happened with the carbon cycle, what the results were, how long it took to kind of balance again the Earth systems?
Yeah, so I think the most instructive one, in some ways the least instructive mass extinction, is the one that everyone knows about. It's actually the most recent one, 66 million years ago. It wiped out the most charismatic animals in the fossil record, and it did so in the most spectacular way possible by, hitting the planet with a rock the size of Mount Everest going 20 times faster than a bullet, and maybe it was all over that day. It could be more complicated than that. But every other that's a one-off sort of catastrophe. As far as we know, asteroids aren't responsible for any of the other mass extinctions. And all of the rest of them are sort of caused by these derangements of the carbon cycle or pushing the climate up beyond a threshold to which life on Earth is adapted at the time. And sort of the most instructive one is by far the worst mass extinction of all time. The dinosaur mass extinction doesn't even come close to this one. It's called the end Permian mass extinction. It happened 252 million years ago. And this one very clearly is caused by just a planet deranging amount of carbon coming out of the ground. It's the fossil record goes like sort of eerily quiet for millions of years afterwards. There are sort of little islands of recovery and things, but it really takes 10 million years for the planet to recover. For a long time, so I guess to set the scene, this is, as I said, 252 million years ago. It's before dinosaurs even exist yet. There are things walking around on land. A lot of them would have been kind of unfamiliar. They are, there's some reptilian looking things and things that are actually closer related to us that look like reptiles, and there's trees. And so there's a land ecosystem, and there's reefs in the ocean made of corals that don't exist anymore. And trilobites are still around if any of your listeners have been to a natural history museum. And in the wake of that, basically all those lines of life, except for a few stragglers, are wiped off the face of the earth. And for a long time, paleontologists looked for evidence for an asteroid impact at this mass extinction, given the success of an asteroid in explaining the dinosaur extinction, and they didn't find it. And instead, what they found was that there's this huge area of Russia in Siberia called the Siberian Traps that is dated to exactly the time of the extinction. And what you have there is just this unbelievable expanse of volcanic rock that covers, hundreds of square miles, or maybe thousands of square miles. And the amount of lava that came out of the ground at that time was equivalent of covering the lower 48 United States a kilometer deep in lava.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So like if you talk about Yellowstone or something in the same sentences, it shouldn't even be mentioned alongside this thing, because it's just a totally mind-blowing amount of lava. But even as wild as that much lava coming out of the ground in one area of the planet, it doesn't explain why things at the bottom of the ocean on the other side of the planet are going extinct. So it's not actually the chaos on land that's driving it. It's the gases that are coming out of these volcanoes. And one of the most abundant gases that comes out of volcanoes is CO2 to begin with, but these eruptions also had the misfortune of burning through one of the largest coal basins in the world. And they lit on fire lots of coal and lots of natural gas. And they injected tens of thousands of gigatons of carbon into the air over thousands of years. So the temperature you see, if you're a really clever geochemist, you can figure out how much warming there is. There's about 10 degrees C warming. So this is sort of like an 8.5 C situation. But still, this plays out over thousands to tens of thousands of years. And the best estimates is that we are currently injecting CO2 into the atmosphere 10 times faster than even the worst thing that's ever happened in the history of the planet. So that gives you sort of like a sense of how unprecedented what we're doing is right now. We haven't warmed the planet that much yet because we've only been doing it for a much shorter period of time. But this event sort of stands as, in the geological record, it's sort of a warning sign that this is, if you keep going down this road, it's potentially, you could end up in this complete nightmare world. I doubt that we will make it that hot for a few different reasons. I don't think we're going to reproduce it, the end Permian. I think, human societies would fall apart long before that you get to 10 degrees of warming. Other extinctions are associated with much less warming, and you still see sort of things dying off all over the planet. So yeah, it's sort of this worrying thing in the fossil record that shows us what can happen. And all the drivers of the extinction are the things that we're starting to see the first glimmers of now. So things like ocean deoxygenation. The ocean lose a ton of their oxygen in this mass extinction. And, already since 1960, our oceans have lost 2% of their oxygen, which, might not sound like much, but when you're talking about percents of oxygen in the ocean, these are things that can really have dramatic effects on life on Earth. The warming that just gets too hot around a lot of the planet for a lot of life. And then things like ocean acidification, which is what happens when CO2 reacts with seawater. That's thought to be a driver of this extinction. So all these things that we're sort of seeing the first glimmers of, you see in this extinction, which I think is sort of concerning. And if we, are good about learning our lessons from Earth history, we would know that we should stop doing it. But I don't know if we will need to be taught that lesson or whether we'll learn before it's too late.
Is there an event in the past, one of these sort of past extinction events that created around, I don't know, maybe 3 degrees warming? And I say that because, we've just had a whole treasure trove of leaked documents again around what Exxon, Shell, BP, all these big oil fossil fuel giants know and what they think. And it's clearly stated in their literature that they think the path to 1.5 is dead. Maybe we will be able to limit it to 2 degrees, but even that is looking a bit shaky. So we are looking at between 2 to 3 degrees, kind of at a minimum now, even though I understand that between that 2 and 3 is actually there's a big difference between 2 and 3. But were there extinction events that were within that bracket that we can look at to get an idea of what might happen?
Not really. All of these past events that are driven by CO2 are slower than we are. So the extent they happen on totally different planets. So it's hard to make an analogy sometimes. And we really are in uncharted waters. 3 degrees would obviously be a lot better than, 5, 10 degrees. But for things like ocean acidification, it actually, the rate is what's more important, not the total amount of carbon. So we might be, the amount of acidification we might see by the end of the century could be equivalent to this event that happened 56 million years ago, that the world's coral reefs collapse. And, we expect coral reefs to collapse by the second half of this century. So I know that's not a great answer to your question.
No, it's fine.
The only case I can think of where CO2 came out of the ground as fast as what we're doing now is when the asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula, which was made up of a lot of sort of limestoney carbonate rocks. It's thought that that injected something like 400 gigatons of carbon immediately. So that's like 10 years of human eruptions all at once. But there's a lot of other stuff going on there. It's hard to disentangle the effects of that from everything else. So, I think this is sort of a one-off case in Earth history. And the weird thing about it is that it's not driven by tectonics. It's sort of this biologically and politically and financially mediated geological event, which is so strange.
To be honest, I actually really appreciate your answer, because this is not just a carbon problem. And I think that part of the difficulty in responding to the crisis was that some of the delay tactics were essentially focusing on just carbon in order to ignore the systemic drivers, these political and financial drivers that you're alluding to, and suggesting that the carbon problem could be kind of isolated and dealt with. We can take it out of the air, or we can swap out one source of fuel for another, rather than dealing with the fact that we're over-consuming, overproducing, just eating ourselves and the planet to death, essentially.
Yeah, one of the things that does distinguish this event from all previous geological, spasms of climate change is that a lot of those, the chemistry of the surface of the planet alone got so extreme that it drove the majority of life on Earth extinct. To this day, almost all the defaunation and extinctions and destruction that has happened to the environment has not yet been from climate change or acidification. These are things that are, starting to get really terrible and are coming down the road. But the vast majority of our effect on the planet so far has been through direct interference with, through things like hunting and habitat fragmentation and coastal pollution and things like that. So, that's another reason to worry, is that we could reproduce the climate and geochemical effects of these mass extinctions, but layered on top of what has already been hundreds to thousands of years, arguably, of transformation of the landscape through human activity. So it might take less to sort of cause mass extinction this time around. And that's another sort of concerning thing that I came across in my research, which is that it could be that mass extinctions unfold where you have this, it's just by attrition. You slowly kill more and more animals and take over more and more ecosystems. Then you finally arrived at this thing called a mass extinction. Or a more worrying possibility is that they could unfold sort of with the dynamics of a network collapse, where you don't know where sort of the edge is. And then you take out, one, that last node, and the whole thing comes down like a house of cards. And the sort of concerning thing about that people who study Earth's past, and especially these really extreme events, have sort of, some of them at least have honed in on, is that sometimes the stressors for the extinctions go on for a lot longer, and then the extinction itself is this very rapid event. And the only way to explain that is that you have some internal dynamic of the biosphere or the ecosystem kind of kicks into gear. And given that we don't, if that is how mass extinctions play out, and we don't know where that, that threshold is or that tipping point is, then that is even, redoubles the urgency of slowing down or relenting or pulling back our impact on the planet.
And this is talked about, right? I mean, you used that phrase tipping point. We also speak of cascading effects or feedback loops where things just run away, climate change, runaway extinction.
Yeah, I mean, so you get into trouble there's a lot of arguments about this online, especially, among climate scientists about the use of the word tipping points and runaway, because, we're not going to become Venus. The Earth didn't become Venus in the end Permian, but you certainly could cause tipping points where you can no longer salvage, the West Antarctic ice sheet or the Greenland ice sheet, and that's just going to sort of keep melting away, no matter what we do. And things like the Amazon, which, if you deforest beyond a certain point, it might, just keep going no matter how assiduously you try to reforest it or halt deforestation. So there are tipping points in the Earth system. And there's, the more we warm, there's definitely the case that the more feedbacks will kick in. And if we really put a lot of CO2 into the air, some of these start getting very frightening. But that's at pretty high CO2. But again, the Earth is an incredibly complex, dynamic, non-linear system. In Earth's past, very small changes have caused very large effects on the planet and sea level or temperature. So I think every paleoclimatologist will warn you that there are surprises that we're not going to expect the more we sort of perturb the system. And we don't, there's the unknown unknowns, to use a cliche, that I think is what keeps up me and, paleoclimatologists.
The sixth mass extinction event is something that already has, I don't know how else to say this apart from a bit of branding. It's out there. It's a term. It is discussed. I often hear it discussed, though, with regards to biodiversity. We are already going through the sixth mass extinction event with regards to our biodiversity. And it's almost like, as you're talking, it's almost like I'm realizing the chasm in my own thinking with regards to the environment and this sixth mass extinction event. I often obviously think about climate collapse and ecosystem breakdown and all of these things. And then I also think about biodiversity extinction. And yet it's mad. I've been doing this job for ages now, it feels like, but it's almost like I hadn't quite put them into the same bucket. And with you describing these past extinction events, with the fact that the climate changed so much that these ecosystems collapsed and then killed off almost all life on Earth, that then in one case took, 10 million years to recover.
Yeah.
It's so hard to think about. It is so difficult to wrap one's head around it. And we are putting CO2 into the atmosphere 10 times faster than was happening during that event.
Yeah. I mean, it is mind-blowing. I think that's why I was drawn to this topic, a decade ago and haven't come out of it yet, because it really has helped contextualize just how radical the experiment that's being run on the planet is now. And just how grisly mass extinctions look in the fossil record. So you mentioned biodiversity before, and there's no doubt that there's been an unbelievable amount of destruction to the biosphere, and that range sizes among large mammals are massively contracting, and there's been lots of extinctions. I think the thing that makes me not totally just nihilistic about everything is that there still is a lot of biodiversity to save, and we actually haven't reached the threshold of a mass, like the major mass extinctions. You see something like 75% of species on Earth go extinct. And the big one, you see possibly over 90% of species on Earth go extinct. And to drive a species extinct is pretty extreme. You can have a few survivors who make it through. 99% of them can be wiped off the face of the Earth. But if a few make it through, then that species isn't extinct. And in historical times, humans have driven about, maybe around 10%, maybe a little less. So there's still a lot of biodiversity to save. It sort of depends on our behavior in the next few decades, which is another thing that really, highlights the importance of the moment we're living in, not just in human history, but in all the history of life on Earth. I would say these are some of the most, pivotal decades, because depending on how the next few decades go, we could get up into the ranks of these, psychedelically horrible events in Earth history, or if sort of we magically transform our behavior on the planet and human societies and how we power ourselves, and we set aside a lot of the planet for life to recover, you would definitely see, if you're a geologist 100 million years from now looking in the fossil record and trying to figure out what happened, you would see a lot of weird signals if you analyze the layers in a canyon where you're like, oh, something really strange there happened. You would see animals being shuffled around the planet. You would see some extinctions. You'd see it get a little warm for a little bit. But I think we wouldn't be in the ranks of a major mass extinction yet. So that is the good news. The bad news is that, every indication is we're right on schedule if you look at these past events.
I've got vertigo. No, seriously, it's like when you sort of look up at the night sky and see all of the stars and realize where we are in this like incredibly large universe. It's the feeling that I have in my body right now. And I think what's kind of so astonishing is, you used the word if we magically change our systems. No, but it's very revealing, right? Isn't it? Mm-hmm. Because it is proving very, very difficult to change our systems. Mm-hmm. And despite mounting evidence, despite over 50 years of evidence, despite public consensus, despite deep, all of the conferences and deep awareness, nothing actually is changing. In fact, things are objectively, mostly across the spectrum, getting worse. And so I think this sense of vertigo that I have is that we are currently more likely to head to stay on track for that 6th mass extinction event than actually mitigate it.
I'm agnostic about the future. I think it's impossible to imagine the world looking different than the one you live in, but human societies all over the planet have been totally transformed and become unrecognizable. The system we're living in is only a few hundred years old, and what came before it was very different than that. And as we were talking before we got on the air, that sometimes it takes being pushed into things have to get really bad before human societies kind of reorganize, or there's cost to these things. It's more easy to go along with the status quo, and there's social and political costs to be paid if you're the person being like, well, we need to change everything. And sometimes it does take the environment to sort of correct the human institution before they catch up with what is a sustainable way of negotiating their life in the environment that they're living in, which now is a global scale problem. So,
I kind of disagree. I don't think it is an imagination problem. I think that throughout the long history of humankind, there have always been people that have been capable and willing and brave enough to imagine
absolutely
life differently. And the diversity to which human societies were organized prior to globalization and colonization, I think speaks to this as well.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people today that can imagine it. It's more, I mean, I'm just talking about the fact that the policies that are laid out, the direction, the direction of travel, the unwillingness to hit the brakes, just in terms of like what is being touted as politically feasible, that is heading us towards a sixth mass extinction event.
Yeah. And I guess the question is whether there are enough levers that enough people can grab hold of to meaningfully change that direction, or whether the power is so entrenched and monopolized that it's hard to take that over. I think that's sort of the question for the next century or two. There's also people in my world who think just, market signals alone are going to somehow magically get us out of this situation, which I don't obviously agree with. But there's a lot of, in order to meaningfully tackle this, is going to require sort of eroding so many vested interests. I just read this book that's sort of making its rounds in the climate world these days, by this author Brett Christopher. I forget what it's called.
What is it
called?
The
Price is Wrong. Yeah, about how renewables, they're cheaper than ever, which people always point at those graphs. But just because of the way that utilities are set up and the energy system works, they're not profitable, and they won't be in the near term. And relying on electrifying everything with cheaper and cheaper renewables isn't going to happen without major intervention in how we remunerate, electricity generation. And it's going to require public control over a lot of things that are currently private. And, that's one corner of the fight. And there's all these disparate fights that all have to be working in unison for us to, meaningfully avoid some pretty nasty climate outcomes. I think it's the right attitude to just say, well, we have to, let's, go down swinging. So I guess that's my attitude, is sort of the realism about the stakes, which I think are a lot more cosmic than most people appreciate. Just once you start learning about the history of the planet, and understanding the challenge ahead, knowing how bad things could get, but I guess sort of adopting this kind of happy warrior attitude where, well, let's do what we can, find the lever that you can push, which for me, I sort of take the easy way out and say, well, I know Earth history, so maybe I'm helping people by understanding the science of this stuff. But yeah, I mean, I get asked a lot, what can I do about it? And I think it's really just that's a question you have to answer for yourself, and identifying the pressure point that you can apply in the system to change things. And I know I'm talking very abstractly in these sort of grand terms, but I struggle with all these questions myself, about where is the most meaningful way to act. So
I interviewed Jay Griffiths for Monka Bay, and I asked her, if you could get everyone on the planet to do one thing, what would it be? Mm-hmm. And she said, stay exactly where you are and figure out what it is that you can do in your locale. And I think that is really important, especially if we're talking about taking things back into public ownership, which, and decentralizing in order to ward off against the corruption that comes sometimes when things are in public ownership. We are going to need decentralized networks of communities figuring out how to support one another, ground down in the land, the territory that they're in, and share resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, and maybe it's not helpful the way I talk about climate change, because I think if you do read about it as this overwhelming global thing, it's hard to find out where your sort of part to play in it is. I just know that for me, you always see these disputes online where it's like, oh, negative messaging isn't helpful. And actually, this study from this sociologist shows that you should be cheerful about everything climate change. But I know, for me personally, I first got really interested in the topic by reading some books that scared the pants off me, when I was little. So I think it's knowing that about myself. I assume there was some other little me's out there somewhere that needed to hear the same message. So that's the approach I took. But yeah, everyone's approach is different. And yeah, I do think the local aspect to it is really important as well. because you can't, as one person, solve a global problem like this. It starts at a community-wide level.
And it feeds into the same issues of, top-down hierarchy, power dynamics that have kind of gotten us into place where the majority of people around the world want the same thing, and it's not happening. Climate action. But right. I think this big, cosmic catastrophe narrative is good. I'm with you. I don't think that I think people are really resilient and really strong, and I understand that life is like very hard, especially relative to the boomer generation. So we could, life is objectively easier now for a lot of people than it has been for the vast majority of human history. But it's harder for us now than the most recent humans, the generation just before. And so I think that plays into this sense of people feeling rightly hard done by. And I understand then that it's quite difficult to get into this like quite negative headspace around it. But I think this is really important. I think people need to understand we are up against an event that is one of 6 in Earth's history, like hurtling towards it at an outrageous pace in order to kind of galvanize, especially leaders.
Yeah. I mean, on the other hand, so like if you look at a broader perspective on humanity, I mean, one of the reasons why I don't think humans are going extinct anytime soon, but I do think the global industrial, networked societies might be a lot more fragile, is because for most of human history, going in and out of ice ages was really pretty extreme. Again, that happened over, the exit from an ice age takes 10,000 years, but, you're going 400 feet of sea level rise, and North America is covered on Antarctica's worth of ice, and there's a quarter less vegetation on the planet. It's dusty and it's miserable. And then you come into these interglacials like the one we just happen to be in now. But there have been dozens of these over the past 2.5 million years. And humans have, sometimes you see in really particularly harsh climate swings, you'll see speciations of new hominids will show up, and you'll see new tools will show up in the record, or evidence that there's been sort of better control over fire. And humans are super adaptable. There's a ton of us. We live on all of the continents. And so we're gonna make it through. And I think we're really resilient. It's just, like you said, the sort of the lifestyle that we've become accustomed to in the, rich Western industrialized world, and the system that has been built up to support that, that might be a casualty of what's coming down the road. And whatever emerges after it, hopefully will be a more sustainable way of living on the planet. But I don't doubt humans' resilience as a species in the long term. Unfortunately, we might drag down a lot of the rest of the biosphere with us. So yeah, I mean, I need to work on my messaging because it's all over the place. It's both
yeah.
It's apocalyptic and hopeful, and
a bit of a 180 from the beginning, half an hour ago here.
Well, not really. Well, yeah, maybe.
Yeah, a little bit. We're talking about like 6 mass extinction event, and normally what happens when this amount of carbon goes into the atmosphere, and the fact that we're sort of like hurtling towards it now.
Oh yeah, we would not have survived through probably any of those mass extinctions. But I think we can. I don't think there's going to be 10 degrees of warming. I think our species will survive, but what else will be recognizable about either ourselves or the planet is debatable.
Because you think we will act in time?
I don't know. I honestly don't know.
Because this is the thing. Like in the IPCC reports, I mean, we do have scenarios for. There's the pathway to 1.5, which everyone agrees is dead. There's 2, which is looking less and less likely every day. There's that bracket between 2 and 3, which is looking pretty likely. But there are also scenarios for like 4 to 6. Yeah. If people just totally give up on the idea of mitigation. I suppose if wars erupt, if people start digging out more and more oil to fund these kinds of ventures. And cascading tipping points, all this kind of stuff. I mean, I guess this is the thing, like, climate catastrophe is it's still there. It's still looming. It's still possible unless we act.
Yeah, and I think once you start getting into like the 4 to 6 range, then you do start talking about the sort of stuff that I'm talking about. I mean, there was a paper that came out a few years ago showing that 5 degrees at the pace we're doing is like easily sufficient to reproduce some of these catastrophes in Earth history. I guess I just sort of like swing because like I said, it is such a pivotal time to be alive, and I keep open the possibility that things will look different in the next few decades, that I vacillate between optimism and pessimism because there's plenty of reasons for the latter, but I'm trying to hold space for the former, I guess.
And I think it's important. And I am with you, right? It's not hope, it's not belief, it's just, continuing to fight every single day, and to talk and to learn and to be incredibly willing and open to see other people doing that all around the world. Like I still have this kind of faith that, not that we are going to, I think people sometimes think we will still be able to like just swerve out of the way. Like, no, certain things are going to happen. Sea levels are already rising, as you said. The oceans are deoxidifying. Acidification is increasing. Things are going to be bad, but I have faith that we will be able to come through with a better world and mitigate against the worst possible outcomes, like 4 to 6 degrees, through a process of collaboration and eroding those vested interests, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I'm still fighting for that with you. Yeah. But I do think that it is really important to like hold up the alternative.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I feel like that's the uneasy place I sort of inhabit in my thinking about this stuff. I mean, for a long time, I was like, I'm going to write about climate change from an earth science perspective, and I just want to know the science, and, I'll leave the political and social stuff to people who are experts in that. And what I've realized is that, like, in completely hijacking the global carbon cycle, now, the temperature of the planet in the future, and the pH of the oceans, and the oxygen levels in the oceans is no longer, determined by Earth system processes like it has been for all of Earth history. It is fundamentally rooted through human institutions, which, supposedly we have control over. So it's, I've had to sort of grudgingly come into this human world of, what do we do about it and solutions? And there really isn't any disentangling the science from the political at this point. So yeah, that's sort of been a revelation for me while I've been writing, and why my prescriptions are not fully formed, because I'm still working it out for myself.
I think it's important to. I think the prescription that you gave is the best one that we can, which is that people need to figure it out. And there's so many resources available to people that would like to figure it out. And the action always begins at home. And I think this idea of like seeing one another and the earth as an extension of like one's own self, one's own body, and like the body politic kind of taking over again and coming back to a sense of like grounded reality. I hope this isn't just word soup, but so much of this problem is like this linguistic gas that fogs the reality of the situation. Like, we can divorce, like the economy can be decoupled from the biosphere, or we can like digitize everything, or like dematerialize everything. And these things take a huge amount of energy and materials, all this kind of stuff. And it's nothing more than like a magic turn of phrase, essentially. So people figuring out what they need to do is like the only thing that they can do, really.
Yeah. I mean, I've said this before, but I think the pandemic, at least coming out of it, it was sort of this useful demonstration that the physical economy is made out of, or the economy is made out of physical material stuff. And that, abstract numbers on a Bloomberg terminal in your office in a high rise in New York City, they're changing a lot. But at base, what that is doing is directing flows of resources from one end of the earth to another.
Yeah.
And the economy is like fundamentally held up by this ongoing explosion of energy coming out of the ground. And, I don't understand people who sort of take this immaterial view of the economy. It doesn't really make any sense to me. I don't really understand what they think, what it is, if it's not, how resources are allocated and the transformation of raw material into finished goods and stuff. All that takes energy. It all takes material. And I do so there's this, I'm sure, you're well aware of these arguments between like neoclassical economists about, growth can be totally decoupled from material use. And then usually people from the science world will sort of read a neoclassical account of the economy for the first time and be like, this doesn't make any sense. Why is there no energy? Why is there nothing physical in this? And so I'm sort of in that camp where, I don't know if you've interviewed him before, but there's just this very elegant argument made by this. I think he's a physicist, I think, at UC San Diego, Tom Murphy, where he's like, even if you take the most conservative relationship between energy use and economic growth, and you plot it out a couple hundred years from now, then the economy is producing so much waste heat that the oceans will be boiling off. Wow. And in 1,000 years, the economy is producing so much waste heat that it's more energy than is put out in the sun in all directions. And so obviously we're never going to get to that point, because that's impossible. We're never going to be making enough waste heat that it's going to be meaningfully changing the temperature of the planet. But it's just sort of a argument ad absurdum that the current path is not sustainable. So whatever emerges after that is going to look different. I just don't know what that is. The economy is a physical thing, and I don't know how it's going to be changing in the coming decades, centuries, but it's going to look radically different at some point.
I think what we're also seeing right now is just how physical a thing politics is as well. Like living through the boom. I didn't live through the boom, but the boom after World War II, the unification of Europe, the peace project, and the relative peace that was enjoyed by the global north as they were off, economically ransacking the rest of the planet through different means. I think we had forgotten just how physical politics is. And for me, seeing the assault on Gaza, researching and being in touch with the West Papuans who are experiencing the assault from the Indonesian government, the assault on campuses by police officers, by the state, the criminalization of protests. Like, we are remembering, I think, in this part of the world, that politics is also a physical force. Everything, in fact, is material and physical and energetic. And
I mean, politics has always been the way of organizing how resources are allocated in society. And the one that we have now is very strange from most that have ever existed in human history. Sorry to interrupt.
It's all right. I agree. But it's like, there's just this sense, I think, of coming home to the reality of what the world looks like when you don't have either a huge amount of like material resources and energy resources at your fingertips, or what the political class will do in order to get their hands on or perpetuate their control over those resources. And I think that's essentially what is now coming home to roost in Europe, certainly, and I think in the United States. I don't live there, but I watch from afar and it looks pretty scary. And so, I don't know, to me, it's a pretty blurry thought, but there's something about like understanding the deep time of the planet in like this very physical way, like feeling that as well in your own body, understanding the Earth system as an extension of, or you as just a part of this like physical ecosystem, and feeling all of these forces that are acting against us, and then how to like collectively organize as well to be an opposing force in order to try and build something else, build an alternative, or build an exit into which, like, through which we can bring people and invite people and hopefully begin to then do the other, like the physical acts of care that we need to do, like repair, reparations, rewilding, reconstruction, ecological reconstruction, all of these things. Yeah, the more I think about it, the more that it becomes a physical thing for me these days.
Yeah. I mean, the most, salient thing about what the, global industrialized world is doing today on the planet is that it's just so far out of equilibrium and so beyond the normal operation of the carbon cycle that it's just completely, it's impossible that it will persist very far into the future, because the Earth has seen this before and it doesn't go on forever. These are even the most ridiculous climate events ever are called transient, because on the long term the planet has ways of restoring itself. And again, no matter how much humanity dishes out in the next few centuries, if you care about Earth in the long term, it's going to be fine. In 10 million years, there's going to be, even if we consummated a mass extinction, there's going to be a new biosphere and things will have recovered and the ocean chemistry will be back. But we don't live in that time frame, and we live in this one geologically unusual, completely out of control moment when sort of all these systems are going haywire. And yeah, the big question is whether someone can grab the steering wheel in the next few decades, or the Earth will sort of correct us for us. So yeah, that's sort of what we've been talking about for the last for this call. And as you can tell, I don't know what the answer is to any of it.
I wrote a piece a while back that I get quoted back at me quite a bit. And it was about this idea of like the steering wheel in the car, and like who's driving the car, and then actually is it a driverless car, and like are we like what do you do with a driverless car? Like how do you grab the steering wheel of a driverless car? And the last line was aim for the tires, like.
Nice.
And it for whatever reason it did speak to people. So whatever that means, I think for anyone listening, aim for the tires, whatever that means.
Well, yeah. I don't know if I can totally sign on, because like, I think the best possible situation would be some sort of managed transition to something else. And again, because I think it's such I think the phenomenon of humanity in general is such a complex networked thing that I think sort of like an uncontrolled collapse, which certainly would reduce CO2 emissions of just all human societies all over the planet, would be a bad thing for most people who had to live through it. So I think that's like another alternative that I wouldn't sign on to, but it's something in the middle. It's this like really tightrope walk that we have to do to sort of step down and from the sort of activity that we're doing now in some way that leads to a better future for the vast majority of people alive. So I don't know if that made any sense, but.
Well, it does, but I think that it's, if I may, a bit, no, naive is the wrong word, but.
I mean, maybe it's naive. As I said, I just started thinking about this stuff.
I think it's just I think anyone would agree a managed transition would be the best way. But we have had, 5 decades of the information being deliberately dismissed, ignored, corrupted, the science ignored, and even now at international conferences when the evidence is on the table and pledges are being made, nothing is being written into law. And this is kind of the idea of a driverless car. Like, this is the system acting in itself. Nobody is particularly in power to do differently. So it may be the radical action to put, a stick through the spokes or slam on the brakes, essentially, is the thing that you need in order to then trigger the possibility of managing a transition. Because this is a critical period, as you've been saying. And I think that, we're running out of time, I think, to have the debate about how it is that we take action. And I think communities around the world are just going to start taking action in whatever form they can if our leaders will not.
I totally agree that sort of like the inertia in the past few decades has been unbelievably frustrating, and the information about how bad things have been has not been meaningfully connected to the levers of power. There just isn't. There's this, you know, there's been no connection between those two worlds at all. They've sort of been operating in parallel. And the people who sort of propose a version of everything getting better by just doubling down on the way things have been really frustrates me, because, look at where it got us in the past few decades, since people always point to James Hansen's testimony in front of Congress, but, LBJ was talking about this stuff. If you want to get really crazy with it, like Svante Arrhenius in 1896 was talking about this stuff. And although he thought it would actually be a good thing, because he didn't know, he thought it would help plants and stuff, but that was a long time ago. So yeah, it's not a matter of more information. And it's not a matter of, just letting market signals do their thing. And, why are you green lefties? Don't you see that renewables are getting so much cheaper and this is all going to solve itself? Like, obviously it's not. And, so if it really looks like we're headed towards that, like, apocalyptic, mass extinction world of like 5 to 6 degrees, then I think, yeah. I mean, we should have motivated ourselves to be on again, I'm saying we again, but like, yeah, it should have been like a global coordinated effort decades ago to figure this out. And it just hasn't been. So yeah, I know I'm rambling here again, but
No.
I share all the frustrations you do. I'm trying to work out for myself what you actually do now that we know what we're doing isn't working. And so, yeah. And I think a lot of it is sort of like boring, nitty gritty stuff. Like this book I mentioned earlier, which is really gets into the wonky stuff about public utilities and stuff, which no one wants to read about. It's not necessarily a fun read, but knowing where those sort of like pressure points are in the system is really important. So, it requires people who have expertise in all these different areas sort of coming together and coordinating their efforts at once. So again, it's this sort of local approach to a global problem.
Which is totally critical, because I mean, even when we think about this cosmic catastrophe of the potential 6th mass extinction event and 4 to 5 degrees warming, currently already there are communities that are losing their homes.
Absolutely.
Because sea levels have risen. Languages are going extinct at an unprecedented rate. People are being, 33 million people displaced in Pakistan in 2022 by the floods. Like, it's already on our shores. It's here. At least the taste of it is here. So if we, and yes, use of the royal we, but if we didn't take action 50 years ago when we should have, then the next best time is now. And
absolutely,
figuring out how to do that is critical.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Peter, listen, thank you so much for your time today. It was a real pleasure speaking with you. I will put links to your books in the show notes so everybody can go and get a copy. My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
Well, I have a good friend who's also a climate reporter who had a book come out last year called Over the Seawall. His name's Stephen Robert Miller. And I thought it was a really useful book that, again, is sort of takes this, this is somewhat, it's not cynical, but it's sort of a realistic view of our efforts to combat a lot of this stuff. And the whole book is about how adaptations can fail. So sometimes massive human infrastructure projects that supposedly make, help with water in Arizona, or seawalls to protect against rising seas and tsunamis and things, can actually give people a false sense of security and lead to things like overdevelopment, and then that make them far more vulnerable down the road to future disasters. And I think it's sort of like a helpful exercise in sort of illuminating how kind of human hubris to tackle sort of a variable and sometimes, difficult natural world that we try to, negotiate our existence on, efforts to sort of control it can massively backfire. And I think in the future, we're going to be tempted by, building things like massive seawalls and stuff. They might provide people this, false sense of security, but it's something to keep aware of. And it's part of the climate story that you don't really hear a lot about, because it sort of is sort of this negative sounding thing. But if we don't understand, our propensity to try to put up these defenses in the face of big, overwhelming natural systems, then we could make ourselves even more vulnerable down the road. So I really like that book. And so.
Brilliant. Well, listen, I can't wait to speak with him. Peter, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter inspired by each interview. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.